are living in a world where technology is no longer just assisting humans, it's beginning to act independently. But here's the question few people are asking deeply enough. How do we know these systems are actually safe? Join me as I welcome today's guest, who is a globally recognized expert in the safety, verification, and validation of autonomous systems. He's advised governments, regulators, and industry leaders on autonomous vehicles, AI systems, and safety frameworks at a time when the world is racing towards automation faster than policy can keep up. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Siddartha Khastgir from the University of Warwick. Hi, Siddharth. Welcome to Common Ground.
Thank you so much, Lakshmi, and thank you for the invitation. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today.
I want to know what fascinated you about intelligent machines and autonomous systems.
I think the biggest thing that got me into this domain was the fact that when I was working in the German automotive industry before my PhD, the biggest safety challenge that the industry had was in the field of automation. So as an engineer who's curious to tackle the biggest challenge that is out there, so I ended up doing my PhD in this space of how do you prove that autonomous systems or intelligent systems are safe, because nobody knew back in 2014-15 timeframe when I started my PhD. So that's what got me into it, because a way to solve the biggest question that existed for the industry.
The autonomous technology now today is reshaping society completely. And you work in this area that is filled with hype and fear. Why are you so optimistic about it?
I think it is my duty as an engineer to be optimistic about it. But I would slightly qualify that by saying I'm realistically optimistic in this space, because I believe firmly that engineering has a way to change society for the better. It has done that over the last many years. So almost everything that we use today is a product of engineering, be it your cars, be it your road infrastructure, be it the PCs. The fact that you sitting in India and I sitting in the UK can talk to each other right now is a byproduct of engineering. So it has changed our lives for the better. But again, with power comes a big responsibility also. And that's why I say I'm realistically optimistic in this space, because I believe the space is transformative, but has to be done in a cautious manner.
Sure. So take us back to your journey in terms of engineering and then, choosing that field of study. How did that pan out for you?
So it's a very interesting story from that perspective. So I always wanted to be either a heart surgeon or cardiac or a mechanical engineer, an automotive engineer. So when I was growing up in Delhi, so both my parents are doctors, and so I had all this medical history associated with that. But at the same time, I was a big fan of Formula One. So it was like either I would become a cardiac surgeon or I will become a mechanical engineer. It's quite chalk and cheese, if you would say so. Then I ended up sitting through the entrance exams. Luckily, and I think life-changingly got into IIT Kharagpur. So IIT Kharagpur is a absolutely fascinating place which will change people's lives for the better in ways no other IIT I personally feel can change anybody's life. So that changed in a way the way I looked at engineering, the way I looked at the impact of engineering. So going into IIT Kharagpur, when you are entering an IIT, the great thing about it is you think you're the best. And when you enter the IIT, you're surrounded by the best. So it's like you get inspiration left, right, and center. And I think that cocoon and that ecosystem that we had was a big thing for me. And then one of the things that came out during my time is the difference between doing fundamental research and doing applied research. And during that time, it was quite fortunate for me that at the end of my third year, I ended up doing a summer internship at WMG at University of Warwick. And that's how I got to know about Professor Lord Bhattacharya at that time. And little did I know at that time that he was also an IIT Kharagpur alumni. And he's changed the whole British manufacturing ecosystem, has a huge role to play in the UK-India corridor. We're talking about the UK-India corridor. There's nobody better than Lord Bhattacharya, who epitomizes the UK-India corridor. So when I came here, I saw that there's a very different way research happens at WMG at that time. And it's essentially what we call as applied research, taking research, but actually applying it at an industrial application. And there's one thing Lord Bhattacharya said that has stuck to me all along is that don't publish papers that nobody would read. So I think that's the fundamental thing that we do at WNJ, and that stuck with me all along. And that's actually kept me motivated to stay in academia, but always working at the interface of academia and industry. Now, and over the course of last for 4 or 5 years, I've added the interface to policy making also. So I end up now working at the interface of academia, industry, and policy making. And that's what keeps me interested and excited in this space.
Absolutely right. And I'm so glad that you brought up, the name of late Lord Bhattacharya, who I've been fortunate enough to meet and, be in the company of. But what a phenomenal institution he's built. And it's just amazing to see that, Siddharth, you're following into his footsteps. Most people interact with AI very casually. So we use our phones, maybe some apps that, we're trying to figure out, or chat GPT. But your work deals with systems where mistakes can cost lives. So what does safe actually mean in the autonomous systems? So is like a 99% safety enough when machines are making life critical decisions?
So I think one thing I would say to you, and for any technology it's out there, be it AI or non-AI technology, life critical, non-life critical, no technology is 100% safe. The concept of absolute safety is a myth. It's about how you use the technology. And so what we call as a concept of informed safety. So the user of the technology is aware of the true capabilities and limitations of the system and decides to use it within that manner and within those constraints. So if I give you a very small example, so you might be driving a car today, tomorrow, or whenever you do, you know what to do with the car and what not to do with the car. So if you drive it outside its constraint, like so you're driving a high speed, then you will end up being in an unsafe situation. So just because there is a technology out there, that does not mean it is safe. It is safe only within the constraints it is in. So when people talk about autonomous technologies, we have this very utopian belief, very philosophical belief, it has to be 100% safe. No technology can be 100% safe. So one thing I would really want people to understand is, don't talk about absolute safety. Talk about how you can use a technology safely, which is what we call as informed safety.
So I wonder, humans make mistakes constantly. Why do we expect machines to be perfect?
I think because we think that we are perfect, so machines should also be perfect. So I'll give a very, very small example on this. If you do a survey and ask 10,000 people, are you better than the average human driver? Everybody would say yes. So if everybody is better than the average human driver, what is the average human driver? So as humans, it's in our tendency to think that we are better than who we actually are, and we are perfect. So I think that's the first thing I would say, because we believe we are perfect, so we want machines to also be perfect. So that's the first reason around it. But the biggest issue that we have here is that we forgive humans for making mistakes, but we do not want to forgive a machine about making mistakes, partially because the way our legal framework is, especially if it is causing safety critical issue, our legal framework is such that the machines are not given that much leeway, and for good reason also. That I'm not saying that's wrong actually, but the issue is then we need to understand what are the limitations under which the machine should still always work safely, and what are the conditions under which it will not work safely. So that's where we tend to focus on the fact that machines will make mistakes, but is that mistake a legitimate mistake, that it was not supposed to work within those constraints, or is it a mistake because the machine was inherently unsafe? They are two very different things.
Still right. It brings a big question around that trust aspect as well. Do you think society will ever trust autonomous systems completely?
I hope so. that's the part of my job at WNG, and the work that we do with the UK government. I think society will absolutely one day accept and trust the autonomous systems, but there's a big role to play for the different stakeholders, all the way from industry, policymakers, advocacy organizations, to build accurate trust. One of the big issues that we see with AI and autonomous systems is people think a system can do more than actually what it can do. And that is a more unsafe situation than just using the system in like we all generally do. So I think that's the big issue that I see, that society will trust, but they need to be taken on a journey. And that journey needs to be informed with accurate evidence and accurate data so that they can build their mental model about what the system is, what it can do, what it cannot do, how should they be using it, should they use it in the morning time only, or at night, or only in summers or winters, and so on and so forth.
Absolutely. And I think that fear is also founded in, data privacy and invasion of privacy and things like that. Because a lot of people are concerned, who is the owner of that information. It's a lot of personal information, data, statistics. So I suppose that's not so unfounded after all. You said you also now are in the policy space, and the argument always is that technology, and policy, for policy, it's always a catch-up game. Policy is not really able to think ahead to where technology is going. So, what's your reflection on that? What's your experience within that space now?
So I'm a big believer that policy and regulation can be a huge enabler for technology, but it also plays a big role to protect or prevent the introduction of unsafe technology. So I think it's very important to highlight both sides over here. So I would not say policy in the space or regulation in the space of AI is lagging, but I would say that a lot of the governments and policy think tanks are looking at what is the best approach to actually try and regulate a technology that is so fast moving. So by the time you have a regulation, generally it takes between 2 to 3 years in any country if you're very fast. In 2 to 3 years in today's world of AI, that what you were regulating on day zero is now very different. So how do you come up with an agile regulation mechanism is an open question right now that countries are trying to understand. And that's where the role of guidelines and standards come in. So you don't yet have full blown regulation, but you do have guidelines which are much more faster to develop, which are informed by industry and academia in terms of what is good and what is not good. But then you can revisit them in 6 months or 12 months time and to see, is that still actually true? Because if you think of it, 3 years back, no, ChatGPT did not exist and AI was very different. So and now AI is very different actually. So if you were trying to develop an AI regulation during the pandemic time, now that would be obsolete. So it's very important to appreciate the pace of development, but then come up with different types of mechanisms like guidelines and standards to that can keep a pace with the technology development also.
And I think we are already in that space where we need to look at dynamic policy making as opposed to, set in stone. This is what will stay for the next 200, 300, 500 years. We're already at that place and time where you need to be more dynamic, more open, flexible to understanding, learning, especially within where technology is involved. So, what worries you more today? Is it bad technology, bad regulation, or is it misplaced human trust?
I think I will always say misplace human trust, because I feel human trust is what dictates the use of technology, and a safe technology can be used in a very unsafe manner, and an unsafe technology can also be used in a very safe manner. So it's all about the way humans perceive technology. And my big fear right now is people who are being exposed to this technology across the generations, be it in India, be it in the UK. Some are familiar, some are not familiar, some are updating their mental models on the go without any information from any accurate or leading academic sources. So people are making their mental models, or they're thinking about the technology or expectations without having any proper information or context around it. And sometimes it can lead to very misplaced trust, and that then ultimately leads to unsafe situations, unfortunately, maybe even loss of lives in the case of autonomous vehicles or automotive. And that's what actually bothers me the most. I think regulation is fine, technology is fine. They're also important. But if you want to ask me to pick one, I would say misplace human trust any time of the day, at any time of the night.
And that's the endeavor, right? I mean, that's what you're trying to build: more human trust, more trust into technology. So with AI and all of this future tech, actually not future anymore, but current tech, is the biggest danger actually overconfidence in AI, or is it AI itself? It becomes even more complex when autonomous systems move from, say, convenience into public infrastructure and geopolitics. In your experience, which countries are leading responsibly in autonomous innovation? And what are the biggest lessons to learn from around the world?
So I think that there's two different aspects to that question. It's a very, very loaded question, Lakshmi. So let's split responsible and with speed. They're two different things. Doing something responsibly can sometimes mean that you're not the first, and doing something at very high speed can sometimes mean that you're not doing it responsibly. So they're two very different things. I think the leading countries would be the obvious ones in this space. The US, China, UK is also now catching up. India has huge potential. We had the India AI Summit earlier this year in Delhi. So what I personally believe, for technologies that are transformational, it is not always in the interest to be the first. It is in the interest to be the best. And sometimes first does not equate to best. So for me, the most important thing is that you cannot be lagging by a long duration. But for me, it is okay to not be first as long as we are the best. And especially India provides a huge opportunity because of the scale. The scale that we have in India attracts everybody, be it from data, be it from skills, be it from workforce, and all the investments that are now happening in AI infrastructure in Andhra Pradesh also now with Google opening up their setup there. So I see huge potential in that space, but we should not lag too much in this space with the other countries in the, for example, the likes of US and China. I think everybody in the world now uses this term China speed. So trying to work at China speed is become a thing now in the industry, especially in the automotive industry. So I think there's due consideration that we should give to speed, but at the same time, doing it responsibly is also very important. But the big challenge I see with that is I get to speak to a lot of philosophers, and a lot of philosophers talk about 30,000, you should do this, you should do that, but they can't convert that into what it means as a data engineer. What does it mean as an AI engineer? What does doing AI responsibly mean at a day-to-day activity level? And I think there's a huge translation, and nobody's actually looking into this. People talk either 30,000 or people talk at the very ground level. And that translation needs to be focused on. And I think that's where a lot of the focus was of the India AI Summit, where the Honorable Prime Minister Modi ji has mentioned about the fact that translating from philosophy into usage is very important right now, especially for the scale India provides.
And responsibility is down to who's paying for it as well. I mean, ultimately, it's the end user who ends up paying for everything. It's whether through taxes or through purchasing of that technology or through anything. So that needs to be borne in mind. And India, of course, has slogans around inclusive technology and tech for all, which again becomes a very, very difficult thing. I mean, India is trying to deliver that. But of course, there are lessons to learn around, how to make that more efficient. And like you said, it's not necessarily always that the speed is the answer. Efficiency isn't just a factor of speed. It's also, how robust it is, and to the best of everybody's ability, how safe it is. That's your domain. That's the space that you're in. So our government struggling to keep pace with AI and autonomy? And do you think regulation now is reactive instead of visionary? We talked about it a little bit, but then are there any examples where you, as a technologist, you almost feel like pulling your hair apart, and what is obvious to you is not that obvious to the regulators or government, or anybody who's a policymaker?
That's my everyday right now. So I wouldn't say pulling my hair apart. I won't go to that extreme, but yes, there is a big translation between being a technologist and being a policymaker. But then one of the jobs as academicians is to be able to convey a very technical topic in a way that a non-technical person or a intelligent policymaker would understand. So I consider that as part of my job. So I'm not worried about it because it's just part and parcel of the job itself. But I do see one big issue that in this space, and this is, I see a big difference from the way regulation was done previously, is for a technology like AI and autonomy that is driving growth and change at such a fast speed, one country on its own cannot do it. You need global cooperation in this space to actually be able to do it right. Because, for example, if you think of the way even the multilateral corporations, the big corporations are set up, they have some resources in India, some resources in Europe, some in US. They're all governed by different regulatory frameworks that adds overhead to them in terms of trying to adhere to the regulations in India, for India in India, then a separate set of regulations for Europe. And so what we need in this space is a global agreement of what is the bare minimum regulation that is needed, that is harmonized. And partially that also helps in pooling of resources across the board in terms of understanding what is the technical things that should go into regulation. Should any technical things actually go into regulation or not? Or should it only be philosophical? What are the pros and cons of the two aspects? So that is the first thing I would say. Global cooperation is not a choice, it's a necessity in today's world of AI governance and autonomy. Second thing I would say, governments, I won't say are struggling to regulate in this space. However, it's a very interesting activity to be governing the unknown. So right now, people, even I being a technologist, don't know how AI would be in 1 year from now. So we are right now working on a regulation, trying to extrapolate from our imagination how the world would be, which is a part of policymaking, absolutely. But this is quite a different way of doing regulation in terms of exploring the unknown. So I think that's the big change that we see. And that's where I see some differentiation between countries. So the unknown for India looks very different to unknown for the UK because of the scale of population, because the democratization of information, of data. So for example, in India, we have UPI, but we don't have anything like that in the UK. Nobody even wants to use something like an Aadhaar in the UK. So I see some of the differentiation happening in that space, but the fundamental thing is there needs to be much more global cooperation. And it's happening, but it's slow because it's not just about you turn a switch and people go from I'm doing for my own country to I'm now doing for the world. There's a lot of cultures that need to interact, people that need to interact, egos that need to interact. So it's a work in progress, I would say.
And we saw that during the pandemic times as well, where, delivering something for everyone is a challenge. I mean, the vaccine itself, the rollout was such a huge challenge that it's not easy. And, the policymakers who are often the elected representatives have to succumb to their electorate and they have to give in to what their people are asking for. And that's not a very comfortable space to be in. So, and there are democracies, there are autocracies, and there are different kinds of governments around the world. And, you talked about China, you talked about America, you talked about India, you talked about, various countries, UK. They're all different kinds of countries when it comes to their governance systems. Do you see a difference in how technology is rolled out or how they approach AI and automation, depending on what kind of country they are and what is easier and not so easy to do with each of these countries?
I would absolutely say there's a difference because as of today, there are different laws that exist. So, for example, in Europe, we are governed by the GDPR Act for data privacy, which requires a lot of overheads on the organizations. And now we also have the European AI Act, which has another level of regulation on top of GDPR itself. Whereas if you compare that to the countries like India or the US or China, they're not governed by the European AI Act. So I think there's differentiation right now. However, I do wonder if there's a halfway house where there is a global cooperation where people say these are the set of rules that are common to all of us. And this is a set of rules that we will need because, as you said, we have to succumb to our electorate. Absolutely. That I would frame it slightly differently. We have to look for the welfare of our electorate. I wouldn't say succumb to give it a positive aspect. I'm a big believer that positive emotion trumps negative emotion. So I would say, yes, a duty of the elected official is to serve the people who have elected and think about their welfare. And as a part of that, there would be divergence needed from some of the global cooperation or global agreements. But the important thing is the divergence is done in a way that is mutually agreed. So a classic example here is when you're doing a free trade agreement, like India and UK has just done a free trade agreement. Not just, it's been a while, but has done a free trade agreement. And those negotiations happen. You agree on some things, you agree to disagree on some things, but it's mutually agreed and both parties are happy. And very similarly, we need to do something like that at a high level. Work has already started, actually, if I may say so. So some of the work that I do at the United Nations, they've now started off an informal working group on AI guidelines, which will then in due course turn into an AI regulation, let's say 4 or 5 years from now, or even a bit more time. So work has started, but the big thing here is to appreciate that there would be differentiation, but that differentiation needs to be aligned with some common principles that the whole world agrees on.
I think there's a lot of things to figure out. I think I agree, and it makes me think whether institutions like UN will become even more prominent in times to come for the roles, the sheer role that they are going to play, or perhaps something else will build, something similar. The other thing is that there's a lot of criticism when it comes to AI and automation. A lot of people liken it to loss of jobs and opportunities. Do you come across that a lot because you sit within that space of manufacturing, automation of vehicles and things like that? So that is a space that is has been traditionally very heavily people driven, and now gradually your kind of goal is to like remove that people dependency and make it people independent, and sort of automation is replacing humans with machines. What's the buzz right now where you're sitting?
Yeah, so I think it's important to highlight the fact that every conversations I've ever had in this space always talk about at least one question or somewhere the topic of job losses comes up. So that's not a surprise. The first thing I would like to say is that I would like to rephrase it from job losses to job retraining and reskilling, and new job opportunities created. So yes, there would be some jobs that might be taken up by AI, absolutely, and that's the whole point of driving efficiencies. But there isn't enough importance given to a parallel narrative, which is about the new jobs that AI would create, and the new opportunities it would create. And why it is so important is, and we were doing some work with a manufacturer in the UK, and they said that because of the reskilling of the shift, because of the shift of jobs, the salaries of the new jobs would be 30% higher than the people who were in the roles earlier. So actually, it's improving people's lives through a higher quality of job as compared to saying you're losing jobs. So I think it's very, very important to highlight the fact that it's not about job losses. It's about improving the quality of job through reskilling. Then becomes a responsibility not only for the organizations like the manufacturers, but also a responsibility on all of us as the labor force. Because if you hear any of the big AI tech CEOs from the States, you don't need to be an AI engineer, but it would be wrong if you don't know how to use AI, if you want to succeed in your career. So you need to know how to use AI. You don't need to be AI proficient in terms of let's create a new large language model. That's not what you need to do. What you need to do is be very proficient in using AI. And that's how you would differentiate yourself in the workforce of future.
It's not just a differentiator, that means it's the necessity. You need to do it.
Yeah.
You need to know how to use it. And it's just a non-negotiable, right now. So innovation and regulation, we've talked about that. But let's talk about the role of academics. So universities like Warwick, they've done path-breaking work. How do universities, shape ethical AI policy? How do you harbor that sort of aspect of ethics within this whole AI and automation discourse?
I think the biggest responsibility that we have as university, especially as WMG at University of Warwick, is to provide the evidence base for policymakers to consider. So as academicians, we don't write policy. We don't have the authority to write policy, but it is our duty to provide the evidence base to the regulators, to the policymakers of things they should consider when they are writing policy. I happen to sit on a few advisory boards for the UK government, where I'm able to do that. I'm very fortunate to be able to do that right now. And so that is one aspect I wanted to mention. The other thing in this space would be, it's very important to again unpick what does ethics mean. So one of the key aspects of that, let's consider bias. So we always talk about the training and the testing data set that people are using, or the data that people are using, or the decisions that AI algorithms are making should not be biased. But how do you ensure that? What does that mean in terms of quantifying? If I say, if I give you an LLM model and say, tell me if it's biased or not biased, what would you actually do as an engineer? Or if you're developing out the model, what should you do to prevent bias? how do you ensure that the training data set was representative enough, especially let's say for a country like India, which is so diverse. So the north is very different from the south, is very different from the east and west. So how do you conjure up a model that represents India? And do you even need to? A question to be answered is your models should be catering to the areas where you're serving. So it could be that you have localized models, and that's where I see things happening for some very specific aspects. And I think India has already done a lot of work in this space with Bhashni and Kosh in this space, trying to be a bit more regional and taking a regional approach in this space. So I think that's very important, I would say. But from an academician perspective, it's about taking those high level philosophical questions and turning them into the engineering level implementations.
Like stating problem statements and sort of looking at resolving them, perhaps. I'm also forced to think, reflect on the last few years and the current generation who have grown up digitally. They've had remote classes, even, kids as little as, who are just 3, 4, 5 year old. They've actually grown up via digital platforms, seeing family relationships and associations. And makes me think that, the current generation is very different from what their previous generations have been exposed to in terms of human connection to other people. So beyond all this regulation, infrastructure, there's then therefore a very deep human question underneath all of this. Machines are becoming more capable, but what remains uniquely human in the end? And are we at the risk of outsourcing too much human judgment to machines?
I think that's a very pertinent question right now. And the way people would differentiate, we talked about being able to use AI is one way of. The other way people will differentiate the workforce of future is to complement AI by providing their own creativity. And that's the human aspect that we as people can bring in when we are actually talking to or using algorithms forward. But another important area to unpick for this particular theme is the fact that because people have misplaced trust in the technology itself, they are using it in ways they shouldn't be, and they are using it for jobs or tasks that they should be doing themselves actually, ideally. And I think that again brings in that concept of knowing when to use and when not to use the technology. Don't think I actually would have survived in the way people have been schooled in the last few years, because I'm a very hands-on person to person. So I would be very scared if I had to do it the way people have done it. And I'm not sure how the thinking of the upcoming generation is when it comes to the way they've been taught using tools that people have. But then again, change is the only constant. The schooling that we had is very different to the schooling that people are having. So I don't think that's an issue. But the point that about the human connection, again, that will also change. And the human connection going forward would be how can we actually use AI in a manner that we can humanize the output. And in some cases, so for example, I'll give you a very small example. You could use AI to do half of your job or maybe 80% of your job, and then you yourself as the creative force behind the concept could do the 20 and then make it a very human like output, and that reduces 80% of your time also. So it's actually making you more efficient in that way. So I think I absolutely do not believe that AI is going to replace humans on a lot of these jobs, especially jobs and especially conversations where creativity is of utmost importance.
That's true. And also, like with children, now studying engineering, they're very, very different from what, has come out, last 10 years, 20 years ago. So they're also blamed for having less resilience. They're not able to withstand pressures. They're not able to, understand context in terms of, I mean, I've worked with an engineering firm and I've seen that the challenge has been they can simulate very well. They can design something on a screen, But when it actually comes to knowing touch and feel, an actual scale of even, constructing something, they struggle because they've never ever been exposed to something like that. How do you at, the university take care of things like that? How do you expose, young engineers and professionals to the engineering sort of side of world and engineers to the professional aspect of the world?
I think that's a brilliant question, Lakshmi. And the way I would say that is there's no substitute for getting your hands dirty with engineering. You absolutely, absolutely have to see and feel what you are doing. Otherwise, you'll never have not only the appreciation of the impact of work, but also you will not understand the nuances of how what you're developing is used by the end users. So very small example. So I'm working a lot in the autonomous vehicle space right now. Yes, we do a lot of simulations. We do a lot of work on PCs, but actually experiencing a technology either in the States or in the UK or in mainland Europe gives you a very different perspective of how people will use the technology. And that essentially needs to be reflected in the design. So the designers should not be designing the technology for themselves. They should be designing it for people. And the only way you will appreciate that is by actually feeling the technology itself. So at WMG, we are all about hands-on learning. So again, going back to the philosophy of and the roots that we have from Lord Bhattacharya is we, yes, do a lot of simulation. Yes, we do a lot of thinking on whiteboards, not blackboards, whiteboards now, but ultimately we build a prototype. And a prototype is built together with in collaboration with industry, where we see what we have done, what are the good aspects, what are the not so good aspects, where improvements can be done. We do customer trials, also user trials to understand how people will use it, because ultimately it has to serve the user's need. So I think that's the way we work at WMG, is not only doing the virtual bit, which is important, and it's increasing. It's increasing as we speak because it's much more cost efficient to do stuff virtually, but it will never ever replace real hardcore hands-on engineering that will always be required. The percentages would change. So yeah, let's say 30 years back, we were 50-50 maybe between virtual and real products. And now maybe we are 80-20, but the 20 still remains.
Wow, that's a high statistic. 80 is like quite high. So we're almost there. So I'm going to do a quick rapid fire round with you. So quick answers to these questions. So one myth about AI you wish people would stop believing.
It will replace them.
One technology that excites you most.
AI.
One autonomous technology people underestimate.
Planes, actually. They are very autonomous right now. People do not appreciate how autonomous our current planes are.
True. Regulation or innovation, which moves too slowly?
That's a hard. I would say innovation focused regulation, if I could say that. But I would take it like that. Yeah.
That's clever. Sci-fi movie that feels closest to reality.
Pandemic, actually. There's a movie that the movie name is Contagion, and it reflected almost identical the way the pandemic happened.
One country to watch in AI?
India.
Okay. So one thing that every policymaker should understand about AI safety.
They need to do something about it.
They leave it to you, I think. Finally, optimistic or cautious about the next 10 years?
Realistically optimistic, I would say.
Okay, you did answer that earlier. Thank you so much, Siddarth. That was an insightful conversation, and it reminds us that the future of AI is not just about technology. It's about trust, responsibility, values we choose to embed into the systems that ultimately are shaping our lives. A big thanks to you, Siddarth, for this very candid conversation and for your patience. For the audience, until next time, please stay curious. Thanks, Siddarth.
Thank you. Thank you, Lakshmi.
This is it for today. If you enjoyed this episode, do share it, subscribe to the podcast, and let us know your biggest takeaways from today. We will be speaking to another interesting guest, a prominent voice from the UK-India corridor at Common Ground, presented to you by me, Lakshmi Kaul, for Global Order. Stay tuned.